Hello and a warm welcome to this special World Economic Forum, CNBC Africa Global Agenda Outlook Debate. I'm Nozi Pombanjo and we're coming to you from the Intercontinental Hotel in Nairobi. Now, the focus of our discussions today will be on the most regionally relevant of the top 10 trends that have been identified by the forum's community of experts and leaders. Now, having taken up the gauntlet and the charge of ICT development on the continent, our discussions will be focusing on the ICT-related trends as they reflect on East Africa. And driving these discussions, of course, are my panelists, Mr. Tewodros Ashenafi, the Chairman and CEO of Southwest Energy, Robin Miller, ICT for Development Specialist at Dalberg, and of course we have Andrew Lewela, Project Manager for the ICT Authority in Kenya, and the Senior Vice President at Oracle, Mr. Alfonso Di Lanni. Thank you so much for making the time to join us this morning. Perhaps let's get right into it and tackle trend number 4, which is the intensifying cyber threats that we're seeing in the world. And perhaps let me come to you, Mr. Alfonso, with this. Is the region, and in this instance I'm referring to both governments and the private sector, keeping abreast with the intensifying threats in terms of cybercrime that we're seeing?
Well, let me just make a comment and an analogy. The fact that we have prisons doesn't mean that we have no teeth, right? So we need to put things into perspective here. Human behavior, ethical principle of individual are difficult to manage. They're individuals. That said, we need to make sure that the rules, the regulations are implemented, supported and implemented widely. Now, security standards have been there for many, many years. This is nothing new. The level of implementation and support in each country and with each product may be different. So I think the focus, in my view, should be in enforcing international standards on security, move away from individual country or regional standards, because that only makes the things more difficult. Implement those standards across the products, and then have a solid leadership in each country for making sure that those are policed. The people do use them, that there is a solid enforcement from the government, and that there is finally a partnership between the providers of the products, software and hardware, and the consumer, jointly working for making sure these rules are solid in every country. So I don't think, personally, that is a regional issue. I think it's a global issue.
Coming from the comments that Mr. Di Lanni makes, Andrew, perhaps you can pick up on whether we're actually seeing, from a policy perspective, a prioritization of policy that could build the resilience that is required to respond to cyber threats. Are we seeing that anywhere in Kenya or broadly in the region as a priority for the government?
Thank you for the question. It's pretty timely actually to see it as a trend on that report. Interestingly, last week, COMESA, with partnership from ourselves, the ICT Authority, the regulators in Kenya, held a meeting for a whole week with some of the COMESA partners. So is it a priority? Absolutely. Have we done enough? I think that therein lies sort of a bit of a dilemma, because I think we're coming to the party a bit late, for lack of a better word, as East Africans, as Africa, on a threat that has existed, but it's just morphing itself to something more complicated. So the Kenya government, for example, we do have in place now a master plan to check on cybersecurity, and we are trying out to develop policies. But just to sort of differ from the view that has been put forward, countries, I think, have to start by accepting the realities and build the right strategies on cybersecurity. And there's nothing wrong with having a regional approach to it, because, as we all know, cybersecurity, cyber threats are cross-border. Yeah. So having a common view is something that we are not averse to, and hence the meeting we had last week. More needs to be done, more collaboration needs to be put forward, and in fact, we will benchmark global best practices, etc. The last point I'd like to make is that enforcement will be key.
Right.
For example, financial services in this part of the world have been denying the sort of the challenge they're facing. It's time to come out of our skeleton closets and articulating what really needs to get done. So we are willing, we are prioritizing, and we'll be looking forward to doing a bit more.
Robin, let's play devil's advocate for 2 seconds. What are the consequences of not having the capacity to respond to this intensifying threat?
Well, I'd like to think of cybercrime as being at a very similar stage to what we're seeing with the internet and internet technologies. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing, and we're seeing new aspects of things all the time. So I think the ability to manage and monitor is going to be key. And I think the opportunity to, I think the risk of not addressing it, to answer your question, the risk of avoiding it can be substantial. And for example, financial services sectors are quite concerned with the challenges that are being faced. And it's both within existing businesses, but then potentially destroying the kind of trust that can be created for new solutions, new innovations that are coming online, if there's not a trust inherently underlying it. But I think one of the things that we can be doing is looking to, as I say, manage and monitor, but looking to hire the hackers, looking to bring in the entrepreneurial thinking that is underlying the 419s in Nigeria or elsewhere, and turning that into a positive role to play to be able to counter and to address some of the challenges that we see coming through.
I mean, a key theme coming out of the responses that we've heard so far, Mr. Ashenafi, is collaboration, partnership collaboration. Where do you see the potential for government and private sector to come together to tackle this problem?
I think a big opportunity for both business, government, and civil society to get involved in tackling this problem. At the moment, internet penetration in Africa is 16%. By 2025, it's going to be 50%. You're going to have massive involvement of internet in the economy. So in terms of cybersecurity, this is something that must be addressed. And the way to look at cybersecurity is like our own bodies. As organisms, we have a certain bacteria and viruses that are part of our system. So the key thing is to make sure that those bacteria and viruses do not overwhelm the immune system. So it's the same with, I think, cyber commerce and so on and so forth. So the collaboration is something that's a must, business, civil society, and government.
We've spent the first couple of minutes really looking at the challenges that cybersecurity threats pose. Perhaps, Mr. Di Lanni, let me come to you and look for a positive angle in this. How do we then create a culture of cybersecurity and confidence in ICT platforms?
Okay, so I think the first thing is you need to have products that are certified against security standards. If you use products who are not formally certified, that is already opening up the door to problems. Certification processes are documented. There are, as I said, standards that vendors and organizations can submit their processes as well as their products. The second thing is these security standards have to be, in my view, consistent. And that's, to be honest, sometimes the problem, in the sense that if you have different products that work against different standards and different level of security, and then you want to put them all together to create a banking system, the chances that security can be broke because of the inconsistency is high. If instead you have a configured system that is certified for its entire function against these standards, then the chances are much lower. That's at the product and infrastructure level. On top of that, as my colleagues here said, of course you need policies. And the enforcement of policies, and this is where I agree with you, the enforcement of policies is a regional issue. The existence of policy or standards should be a global issue. So I think that these are the two levels in my view. Just have products that are robust and self-consistent and certified, and have policies that support those.
Before we move on to the next trend, maybe a quick response from you, Andrew, in terms of the likelihood of us seeing a harmonization of regulatory policies in the specific area for the region. Are we on the track towards doing that?
Maybe, without question, I might speak on behalf of East Africa, the common bloc we have. I'm not sure about West Africa or the SADC region. And from the Transform Africa meeting a couple of weeks ago, the heads of state with the cabinet secretaries in the ICT ministries did agree formally that we will collectively and collaboratively look at some of, number one, infrastructure projects that are catalysts for that sector, and indeed the frameworks that can support that jointly. So for the East African region, you will see sort of regional frameworks that govern and guide us. Can it then move across to the rest of Africa? I will be a bit hesitant to answer the question.
And on that note, perhaps let's take a step forward and maybe jump to the second trend that we'll be looking at, which is trend number 10, which is the rapid rise of misinformation that we're seeing on online platforms. And perhaps let me come to you with this, Mr. Ashenafi. I mean, on the back of the Westgate incident, we had a video going absolutely viral on all the social media platforms of soldiers allegedly looting some of the shops. Now, there is an inquiry that is looking into that matter, but what lessons can we learn here about making sure that citizens have the capacity or empowered to filter information that they get off social networks?
I think that's a very big challenge because every citizen now has essentially a camera and they can upload, or he or she can upload what she sees fit. And I think this is a challenge, again, that must be tackled in a collaborative manner, because we have something like 540 billion emails sent a day. There's so much information being generated daily that to filter this will take an ecosystem which will manage it.
Robin, let me bring in the aspect of what Mr. Ashenafi wrote about how every citizen who now has a camera is literally a journalist in their own making or in their own right. In light of that, how do citizens, or how can citizens hold the media accountable for the output that we see coming across from all platforms?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think one thing that we saw post-Westgate was in particular this aspect of accountability. So citizens were hungry for information, asking for information, and it created accountability both for the media as well as for government and authorities coming into the conversation. It created almost a demand for answers, a demand for information, and I think that's quite healthy. And as we're saying, almost everyone has a phone. I think the combination of the camera phones plus, I believe across Africa, it's increasingly over 100 million users on social networks, having conversations and engaging. So I think the way in which we hold the media accountable is to ensure that more information is available, more information is accessible, and maybe stepping into a question or a discussion about the role of education and how we push each other, push ourselves and push our communities to not only throw information out there, but also challenge information. So looking to find more sources of information to be able to counter and oppose what we're seeing and hearing, and not just take it for granted.
On that point of education, Mr. Di Lanni, what is the role of schools in ensuring that we're empowering young people in particular so that they have the filters that are required?
Well, I don't think we need, on technology, I don't think we need to empower young people. They really get it. I think it's more the older people that don't get it.
Yeah.
What they miss is the tools, of course, the tools, the ability and the possibility of using internet devices, and obviously training and education. So these are critical things that we could do. But the demand from the youth is huge. And their contribution, both in as provider and consumer of information, it's incredible. It has changed the political situation of many countries, as we know and we learn from. So what we need to do is we need to channel that energy. We need to channel that energy into more productive, maybe, and more maybe business or more social scope. And this is where education has a role, because the tools are there. We need to make them affordable, but we need to have the teachers that are able to understand what information age means and how they bring along into more of a positive use of information those pupils. But I want to make a comment on your title of misinformation.
Yeah.
I don't think it exists. What exists is data and information, which is by its nature in modern world democratic. You cannot say misinformation in the internet age. It's just a comment.
I think that's a very interesting comment in light of an article I picked up this morning, and this was the title: "An uninformed society is better than a misinformed one." So we could have a debate, I think, all day about that.
Yeah.
Perhaps, Andrew, let me get your response to that. I mean, I would naturally think that that's a bit of an extremist position to take. Do you concur? And how do we then engage in some of the debates that have titles of this nature?
Bit of a philosophical debate. And I have to be careful. I think this is my personal view, not the government. Especially when you bring in a dimension of security. A country's security, it becomes a bit complex. So with Westgate, for example, it is my honest view that media could be more responsible in this specific area of security. And that's why you saw it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, but the government of Kenya then went to look at how responsible are the media in doing their job. And we don't want to do their job, but are there instances where you have to make some sacrifices in what you throw out to the public and how you do it? And our view is that, yes, sometimes maybe you need to be a bit more patriotic, and I'm getting into a very gray area, where you say the story is big, but what are the repercussions of me throwing this into the social media? It's not an easy question, but we like citizens of a country to sometimes take it upon themselves to say, this might not be the pictures I want to throw out there. And so you might not have the answer you want, which is, does everyone have a role in what they share? Because you cannot control individuals, but yet we want to be responsible.
Let's move on. Of course, both trends 2 and 3, which is one, persistent structural unemployment, and the other, the rising income inequality gap, have a relevance with ICT as a potential lever that can be used to address these two particular challenges. And in light of that, and I want to stay with you, Andrew, on this one, given the portfolio that you carry. Can you give us an example where we've seen ICT being a decisive game changer when it came to tackling poverty in any one of the programs that the ICT Authority runs in Kenya?
A couple of projects we do to sort out that exact issue of poverty, especially in the unemployed youth. And so we've taken multiple approaches. So for example, more than 70% of our economy is the informal sector. And it's our strong belief that technology can actually formalize some of this business, and rightfully so. So for example, SMEs, through automation, can very quickly transform into more effective, efficient businesses where they're able to retain more profits and deliver more value. So using, and some of the members of the gallery will know, we have consistently formed funds to tackle this problem. So we have, the president just launched recently about 6 billion Kenya shillings fund to try and look at this market, the poor, the unemployed, and how can we stimulate them to sort of just quickly get out of poverty and, more importantly, have a more efficient economy running. And this is not only for the youth, unemployed youth, but also women. Because to your second question of inequality, women in Africa are also being left out of the cake, as it were. So we have made a decision to focus on youth and women to have this dual effect of both fixing poverty where we can, but also reducing that inequality. And in ICT sector, we also have specific grants for technology-based businesses, whether in agriculture, healthcare, financial services, for the same reason again, just to ensure that we can quickly transition people from where they are. They're in a rut, but just given the opportunities to get out of it. And let's not kid ourselves. Government does not do a good job of this all the time. So where we can, sometimes we support the private sector to do the same. And that's why companies like Safaricom have done that very effectively through some of their technologies, like M-Pesa. And all we do, where we can, is to stimulate the private sector to do more. So it's not true that we do all the work.
Right.
In fact, we do less of the actual project and more of the enabling environment.
Mr. Ashenafi, how can ICT grow the number of entrepreneurs that we have on the ground? And have we seen any examples of this in Ethiopia?
Well, I think we have, when you look at Africa, 500 million Africans are under the age of 17. And you need to create jobs for this youth. Otherwise, we've seen what happens in the Middle East and North Africa. I think in Ethiopia's case, Ethiopian government has created or enabled the ICT park, where the infrastructure is laid for a platform to create entrepreneurship and create jobs. So I think in Africa, ICT will play a disproportionate role in terms of impact compared to other regions around the globe. And this is something that will be a driver for, I think, job creation.
Right. Mr. Di Lanni, I want to bring you in on the aspects of ICT leveling the playing field in terms of creating a globally competitive workforce. Are we seeing this relationship come together in the region?
Well, yes, because when you talk about technology, it's ubiquitous. With mobile, with internet, you have no boundaries. You can start a business in the neighborhood or in the jungle. You create a website. Who knows what it is? It's a website that sells or a website that provides services to the world, potentially. That's the beauty. That's the beauty. Now, what needs to be at the heart of it is the entrepreneurship that, together with the technology can create this new business. And there are many cases here in Kenya, and I think the government is actually supporting the IT hubs of entrepreneurship, creating businesses out of the information technology. The world of information technology, in my view, has been the first global economy that we have across every other economy, to be honest, and it works very well. So we need great environment created by the government, environment, not necessarily funds, environment, easy to start business, educational program, big infrastructure program. There will be a new airport in Nairobi. There's been an announcement today of a new airport. That will create a number of enterprises, small and medium enterprises that will kind of work around that major project. That major project has to be a country project. But that is the start. And then the SMEs and the private sector, vendors or other individual investors, can actually take advantage of that and spin off other businesses around this. But if the country doesn't have the major infrastructure programs, doesn't have an ICT leadership that puts the framework, it won't work.
Right, Robin, I mean, and I allow you to respond to Alfonso, but before you do, I'd also like you to talk about how we can leverage some of the lessons that we must have learned from commercially driven activities like mobile banking and mobile money, and transport those lessons into some of the developmental targets that we have, and are we doing enough in the region off the back of that?
But recognizing, again, ICT being a driver of innovation, so what you see with M-Pesa now is the way in which additional solutions such as M-Kopa, providing asset financing for solar home lighting, providing electricity, things are being built on top of this, and ICT is being leveraged. So going back to the question, I think there's a lot that we can learn in other sectors and evidence that we've seen. When I think about, for example, healthcare, the way in which technology has been used to address the complete disparity in terms of access to health workers, to doctors, to nurses, Organizations such as AMRAF have deployed virtual learning universities to increase the number of nurses trained on an annual basis from something in the magnitude of 100 to 200 in 2006, 2007 to thousands of nurses being trained annually today. So the kind of increase you can see in strengthening a workforce, the kind of impact that you're seeing on access to financial services, I think both M-Pesa and Equity Bank have been tremendous in demonstrating the impact that that technologies can have. And then going back to your question about the opportunity for ICT within employment, we know particularly for youth, 60% of Africa's unemployed today are youth, and challenging, hugely challenging, but also great opportunities. So as you mentioned, ICT can, in and of itself as an industry, is creating jobs, is creating opportunities, whether it's the growth of mobile operators or the business process outsourcing in certain countries. But we're also seeing it as an enabler to strengthen the supply of talent. So looking at where the opportunities are, being able to strengthen literacy and math skills in the education space, being able to create assessment tools that can better position people to enter the right jobs, so not just a job for the sake of a job. But I think there's a very powerful statistic that says if you employ a young person into their first job and they stay within that job for more than a year, they're 85% more likely to be employed for life. So the ability to use some of these tools to ensure that there's appropriate matching that creates an overall, at a national level, a more efficient allocation of human capital across the board. And then the final piece just being ICT as a platform for matching, so linking employers to potential employees and making that process much more efficient than it's been in the past.
And on that note, we're going to be taking a short break. When we come back, we're going to be dissecting the role of cities in advancing the ICT agenda, but most importantly, be asking the question, is the region keeping up? We'll be right back. Welcome back to this special broadcast of World Economic Forum, CNBC Africa Global Agenda Outlook Debate. Of course, we're looking at the most regionally relevant trends for East Africa that have a big focus on ICT. Now, just before the break, we were touching on, we had said we'd come back and touch on the role of cities. And perhaps, Robin, let me bring you, or maybe let me bring Andrew in on this one. I mean, we've got a new buzzword on the streets, and this is Silicon Savannah. Now, if you will, explain what Silicon Savannah is, and more importantly, how does this reflect the role that cities should be playing to position themselves as engines of economic growth?
Thanks for the question. The Silicon Savannah brand name we've gotten, interestingly, is not necessarily a city-based, infrastructure-based tag. Our view, in fact, of Silicon Savannah is that over the last 7 or so years, an ecosystem of innovation has emerged. And this has consisted mostly of sort of startup, idea-based, innovation-based youngsters coming through, supported by hubs, universities, research and development, governments, private sector. So a sort of semblance of some very organized ecosystem has emerged. And so that's where the Silicon Savannah came from, where we had sort of very innovative ideas that have gone global. And some of them now are getting to scale. So with that sort of brand name, the government was wondering, how can we stimulate this further? And one view is the traditional Silicon Savannah, the Silicon Valley, sort of an epicenter where all these things emerged from. And the government decided to build what we're now calling the Konza Technopolis around 60 kilometers south east of Nairobi. And the idea is to have an actual physical location where some of these players could actually congregate to go to the next level. So it sort of took us by surprise. It happened spontaneously. Nobody sat down and said, we want to build a Silicon Savannah. But some very positive energy came through. And now we're in the sort of Silicon Savannah 2.0, where we want to make the ecosystem more efficient, to deliver more entrepreneurs, more groundbreaking work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where we are with the Silicon Savannah.
Of course, off the back of that, and in relation to that, Robin, we also could see how ICT can play a role in helping cities to sweat their assets a little bit more effectively and play a more meaningful role. Can you give us some insights around those developments?
I think that's a great point. And just building off my colleague here, I think what's so interesting about this tag of the Silicon Savannah is the way in which the innovation ecosystem is emerging, and how the focus on cities like Konza is now asking, how do we construct an ecosystem that's ripe and ready for innovation to ensure we have the appropriate infrastructure, the skills and capabilities, the access to finance, the research and development capabilities, and also the access and understanding of markets. In terms of the cities, how do we better sweat our assets? I think one of the often underplayed advantages of ICT is the efficiency that it delivers for businesses, and businesses starting up and businesses managing large populations, particularly as you get into the provision of public and social services such as health or education. The ability to serve populations is top of mind for policymakers and governments across the continent. How do you deliver equitable health care? And I think the health system is a great example where through different kinds of interventions, you can better allocate the limited resources that you have to those that need it. One of the analogies that comes up from the medical space is often the role of a surgeon, and how in a situation where you need surgery, you end up seeing 6 or 7 people before you actually get to the point where you're operated on by the surgeon. So you're seeing the administrator, and then you have the person that administers the aesthetic. There are a whole wave of people that you actually get to as an individual before you get to that surgeon. So it speaks to something about looking at opportunities, and technology supports this quite a bit in distributing the activities that can be created or delivered by other people, and focusing in what is essential. So from the perspective, again, from health clinics, how do you create services? Maybe it's a mobile call center focused on health. How do you create access for individuals to phone and speak with a nurse or a medical professional to ask the basic questions, which 80 to 90% of the time are perhaps going to be quite basic, and then only use that 10% of the time when a condition is serious or needs medical attention, for that individual, that household, that family to have to travel all the way to a clinic and have to leverage the services. So how do you reduce the strain that's currently being realized on the existing infrastructure by using technologies to deliver information and deliver services more efficiently?
Mr. Di Lanni, perhaps if we were to look at just one of the aspects of what Africa's future cities have to take on in terms of new challenges that are facing cities, and in particular, let's look at infrastructure and ICT infrastructure in particular. How does it ensuring that when you have that infrastructure embedded actually makes the contribution that a city can make in the lives of the people that are residing within the city and the broader community are far more different? Do you think that there's an appreciation that cities can play that role?
Well, absolutely, and there are 2 levels, the physical one and the virtual one. And I think we need to pay attention to both. It's great to have a place where people can physically go to do their business, start their business, but do they have access to high bandwidth? How do they connect to the other center of R&D around the world? Is it easy for them to download software over the network? These are important elements, and how much it costs. These are important elements for cities, because the physical infrastructure will improve. It's improving already here, and it will improve. But the virtual one for ICT and for young generation and for new type of businesses, completely new businesses, it's even more important. Just a case that is on the press is the Bitcoin. The Bitcoin is the power that is needed for that virtual currency to run. It's huge. And so where is that power? Where is the computer power physically residing? Who's managing that? That's another element of cities, this virtual infrastructure, that is often forgotten. It's left to the private or specific maybe ministry, but there isn't a consistent, comprehensive view of what is my digital infrastructure. That is very important, especially because you can build it from scratch in certain places in Africa. It's not yet there. Technology is there. You need to just invest, maybe with, private partners. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who have interest in IT. You need to invest in a structured way on that as well. And then the city become one of the cities of the world.
Right. Now, very interesting tweet that I came across from Mr. Donald Kaberuka, or Dr. Donald Kaberuka. He says, some megacities are actually false. They are cities surrounded by slums, a sea of misery. Let me come to you with this rather tricky response, Mr. Ashenafi. In light of this particular reflection, do you think that ICT is playing a big enough role in positioning cities as the engines of growth that we want them to be?
Yeah, I think we need to go back to basics. As a colleague said, that you cannot surf the internet without electricity, without power. Yeah. So, and that's one of the biggest components that one has to focus on if you're an African leader. And certainly countries like Ethiopia, where we hopefully will be selling you some power to run your IT park. And there's scope for regional integration, so on and so forth. But currently there are, or 2011, there are 22 mega cities in the world. By 2025, there will be 35 mega cities, not necessarily in Africa, but globally. So this is a trend that is going to take place as the rural community migrates to the urban community. I think there must be a planned way of making this transition so that you don't have slums created and housing, infrastructure, and everything that goes around with it.
On that note, we're going to throw, I'll come back to you in the closing remarks, maybe, Robin. We're going to throw the discussion wider to our audience for a Q&A session and allow our panelists to field some questions. Now, let's see if we have any questions that have been lined up from the floor.
Thanks everyone for their comments so far. My question really is on the regional level. Take East Africa. If you look at each country's development plan, they will aspire to have a smart city where technology is the centerpiece of their economy, where they're the hub for the region. Outsourcing is a key part of their economy. International companies come to have services provided to them in that particular country. Is there room in the region for a smart city in every country? What level of coordination and action can the EAC take to ensure that the development is complementary as opposed to competitive?
I would say the fittest will survive. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you're too close to compete, someone will have to have a hedge. That said, again, it's possible to create a network, like very much in the research and development in the university, each with specialization linked to each other. If you look at the ICT world, India is very famous for certain things, California for other things, the UK for other things, and they all collaborate. I think we need to be careful on limiting the opportunity to this part of the world. I see it always larger, more connectivity of knowledge and development. Talking about this smart city and IT investment in the city, we need to also understand that California, Silicon Valley, is not just a place. It's not just a physical place. It's people. It's individuals that are leaders in their segments, and they talk to each other. They mingle. There is money. There's private money coming in. If we have all those ingredients in any of the cities of Africa, it can happen again. But it cannot just be a building, and it cannot be just a youth with a laptop. It won't work. We need to have all these components.
Any additional comments on that?
My contribution to that question is we've taken a view, as Kenya, for example, that for the East Africa community, we'll have a sort of a hub and spoke. So geographically, we have an advantage as Nairobi for all these reasons. A great airport here, but also we see some of the other sort of smaller hubs like Kigali now. We are pretty competitive enabling environment where we want to compete with them, but we might catch up with them. But yet they see our progress in as far as human capacity. We supply them with a bit of that. So I want to agree that we need to allow different countries with their different master plans to execute as best as they can. Because let's be honest, we have some good cities, but are they sustainable? Are they in line with sort of the global green outlay, etc.? So let's allow countries to invest in modernizing and making their cities competitive, but also let's leverage on each other where it makes sense for us to leverage. And you'll see a lot of that, at least with East Africa.
Yes, there's a question right here in the front.
One of the key pillars in spurring economic growth in Africa is industrialization. What role do you see ICT playing, and what would you advise our African leaders to do to have ICT play a bigger role in that agenda? Thank you.
Any particular panelist you would like to direct a question? So you're putting them all in the line of fire. Okay, that's great. Let's take the question in the second row before we proceed.
Question to all panelists also. Eastern African countries have been growing over the last decade economically, and side by side with this growth, we've also seen increasing inequality. And this inequality is especially persistent in cities, which means that with great urbanization, we are probably going to see a lot more inequality again. Does any of the panelists see a role for ICT to bridge the gap between the rich and poor, especially in the cities?
Let me come to you first, yes.
Yeah, I think in terms of industrialization, in the case of Ethiopia, you were seeing a lot of manufacturing, Chinese manufacturing actually moving to Ethiopia, where the government is pushing import substitution. But this should be linked also to agriculture, because again, as I said earlier, the large component of the African rural community are farmers. And so if you increase the incomes of the farmers, you really make a big impact on society. So I think industrialization also should go to the agribusiness as well. I think that's kind of my thought on that.
Do you have comments on the growing inequality that we're seeing in the cities?
I think that's a trend that is global, yeah? Even in places like the United States and other BRIC countries, you're seeing the way you measure inequalities to the Gini coefficient, and you're seeing that coefficient essentially get wider. So there's a trend where I think ICT can play a big role, because if you have the ecosystem, certainly certain barriers to entry into business and so on and so forth are lower through ICT as opposed to larger capital-intensive manufacturing and other things.
Right, let's move right on to
So taking them in reverse order and building off of your second point, I think the widening gap between the rich and the poor, we would all agree, is still substantial. The comment by Kabaruka, as you mentioned, about megacities actually being, in essence, a split between the rich and the poor, the slums surrounding the wealthy areas. I think there are two things. One, to build on your earlier point, going back to basics, I think a reframing of the value of ICT, and particularly access to internet, treating it as more of a utility than a luxury, is something that we should consider. So the ability to treat access to the internet as it is access to electricity. There's a lot of evidence at individual household level of the value of mobile communications on income levels, the impact on small businesses, the impact on access to a whole range of services, quite substantial. I think second to that is bringing people into a conversation, bringing them into the social network, so taking the exclusion and trying to make it more inclusive. So I think there's something there about the ability to use this network or this community that we're building to bring people in, to bridge the gap in that way. But the second comment I would make, I think it's something we don't hear enough about, which is Between the rich and the poor is the emerging middle class. And what ICT and technology is doing for us is it's helping us to better understand a whole class of consumers that we quite honestly don't understand. The decision making, the needs, the investments, we're starting to learn more and more about this, but what is expenditure on education? What are the aspirations? What are the current needs and visions for the future? I think the way in which we engage this next class is going to both grow the economy, and we can talk about the role of SMEs and small business growth in any economy, but it's also going to provide that bridge between the rich and the poor as well. And so it's incremental steps as opposed to the jump from poor to rich or otherwise. So let me stop there and answer that.
Andrew, any comments on industrialization and also the second question on growing inequality in cities?
Okay, I'll start with the latter, with a quick stab at it. I think economists now talk about sustainable growth and inclusive growth. That, I think, is what is the piece missing in some of the growth that you're seeing in Africa. So there is growth, but I don't think it's been thought through in how it affects the entire economy. So, for example, we have an advantage that has been thrown to us as a country through the Constitution. So for the first time since this is our 50th year of independence, we have the devolved governments, where central money is now being pushed down to the bottom of the pyramid. We think that's going to be one of the things that will unlock the disparity or the inequality, where you take some of the opportunities to the grassroots, increase literacy, increase education, and let those people start reaping from the rewards of this big country cake. I think to industrialization, I think the way I see industrialization now is not the way it was 40, 50 years ago, because the two parameters, of course, are competitiveness, where how much does it cost for me to actually produce in any country, and factors of energy, people, labor costs that come into play. For as long as you cannot tick that box, it becomes very difficult to get into the kind of growth we've seen China have. We think Africa has some of those components where you have qualified people who cost a bit less, but we have to fix the other issues of technology and automation of some of the value chains. I think if we fix those 2 or 3 more boxes, you will see us going through industrialization, but not the same as countries like China saw. For example, light manufacturing are some of the opportunities we see as Kenya, not necessarily heavy industrial manufacturing, where China still is a bit competitive. But you'll see innovative forms of industrialization that will take to concert, where we have smarter people and we have the technology to compete. Because I think if you're not competitive, it's very difficult to bring some of those opportunities to bear. So we have to be critical and look at ourselves and say what makes sense and what value can we add to the global chain, supply chain.
Do you share the sentiments of the other panelists?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. I strongly believe that ICT is the most democratic industry of the world, because it actually gives access to knowledge to anybody. There's no difference, there's no pre-selection, and with modern technology, you don't even need to train yourself for using a device, as you know, your finger, right? So the potential is there. Now, to make it available to the poor, that means that it needs to be affordable, and the infrastructure needs to be there, electricity, network, and internet. And this part of the world has made tremendous improvement and innovation exactly in that. Cloud and mobile technology have brought poor people to a level of living was unthinkable before. We talked about some example right here in Kenya with mobile application. But there are many others. And another effect of mobile technology and technology in general is transparency. We haven't talked about this here, but it's a big elephant in the room. Transparency. If you disintermediate through technology the end user through the provider, you have huge effect on the economic chain, and more money will go to the user or the producer for sure. So there's a huge potential. This part of the world has understood that, We have great examples. I think we should just continue on that.
Perhaps a comment that really for you captures the key essence of where you see the region going, and maybe the biggest tipping point that we would have to make in order to make the gains and advances that ICT can deliver.
Yeah, but I think that a lot of people globally don't realize that the African economy, the size is about 3.3 trillion. So it's about the fourth largest economy in the world. And East Africa, other than the oil and gas and other resources that are coming up, you're seeing massive trends in ICT, in industrialization. And I think the narrative has changed, particularly in our region, one of kind of poverty, and the challenges are there, but opportunities, I think, are now what a lot of investors and people are looking at. And I think that's going to continue.
Your final comments, Robin?
I think for me, this whole discussion on ICT has led me to sort of reaffirm that I think we're just at the beginning of the story of where we see the impact of the internet and of technologies, particularly in East Africa and across the continent. So for me, the questions become, how do you build and protect a space for innovation? How do you create the ecosystem? How do you protect from the threats such as cybercrime, but continue to keep the space open to allow for this innovation to happen? And how do you ensure that you're getting the basics right, as you mentioned, so ensuring that it is providing the human capital, the access to finance, the understanding of the markets to really build and facilitate it. So very specifically, two things that stand out for me as areas that will continuously need attention are one, this question of access. I think we don't dig deep enough into the numbers that we're seeing today about who actually has access, how many of those users are active, are they engaging in content that's relevant and useful for the everyday challenges that they're facing in their lives. So I think the question of access will continue to be a challenge. And then the second, very substantial, I think Kenya has demonstrated great leadership in this area, but is a focus on payments very specifically. We didn't talk too much about this, but the fact that payments can start to help us translate virtual social networks and connections into economic value, I think is something that we're just at the beginning of seeing. And the ability to unlock the underlying payments platform, I think, can unlock a whole next wave of innovation.
Andrew, in a minute.
Over the past century or so, we've seen different continents growing at different tempos. But it is clear in my mind that some of the growth we saw on many other continents was a bit inefficient. And we have, in hindsight, the opportunity to learn from some of the growth. But you will see from East Africa, from Africa continent, a very different type of economic growth. Why? Because everything we do, being a greenfield site, is sort of brings exponential growth to the economy. However, because we now have a lot of learnings, you will see a bit more of efficient growth, where we'll say, what is the best technology to make us grow in this and this area? And I think that's where ICT will really help us leapfrog. So you'll see a different form of growth for Africa, and hopefully the North can learn from us in getting out of the sessions.
A brief summary from you?
For me, it's all to do with people, really. And I think this part of the world, I meet people here, and I'm always amazed by their innovation, their drive. They want to succeed, even though their environment is not, always good. And the level of innovation idea that come from this part is amazing. Some cases, way beyond, the Western world, where too much comfort is not motivating, especially youth, to be honest. So it's a great place of the world. Technology, as I said, it's pervasive. We have great examples. We should just make sure, though, that these people, especially the young people, are taught in their education curriculum the right subject, so they come to market with an understanding on how they can use the new technology for their future. And that's a very important point, and I think many people are involved in this, and I think it's absolutely critical.
And that brings us to the close of our special World Economic Forum CNBC Africa Global Agenda Outlook debate. The discussions have been both robust and insightful. Of course, a special thank you to my panelist, Mr. Tewodros Ashenafi, Chairman and CEO of Southwest Energy. Of course, Robin Miller, Specialist in ICT for Development with Dalberg. We had Mr. Andrew Lewela, Project Manager at the ICT Authority for Kenya. And of course, the Senior Vice President at Oracle. And of course, a very special thank you to the audience for their participation. From me and the team here in Nairobi, it's goodbye.